Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into the life and crimes of Sean Vincent Gillis,
Oh, yeah.
a serial killer who operated in and around Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Right.
And, you've given us a variety of sources for this deep dive, including, excerpts from Gillis's Wikipedia page.
Right.
And we're going to dig into all of it to try to understand who he was and the nature of his crimes.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting about this case is how seemingly um, normal his beginnings were,
Yeah.
especially in contrast to the horrific acts that he committed.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a strange contradiction.
Yeah.
We know that Gillis was born in Baton Rouge in 1962.
Right.
His father left the picture early on, so he was raised mostly by his mother and grandparents.
Right, and that kind of upbringing certainly adds a layer of complexity to his story.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that having a difficult childhood, while potentially a contributing factor,
Yeah.
doesn't automatically make someone a serial killer. What's really striking is how his criminal record started out with almost mundane, minor infractions when he was just 17.
Right, like he was testing the boundaries.
Exactly. But then things escalated from there,
Yeah.
DUIs, drug possession charges, and eventually murder.
And that first known murder in 1994
Right.
involved 82-year-old Anne Bryan.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, he actually confessed to this one and revealed that he had initially intended to rape her, but ended up slitting her throat in a panic when she screamed.
Right. That escalation from petty offenses to a brutal murder is a chilling pattern we sometimes see
Yeah.
with serial killers. Their inhibitions seem to lower over time, and the violence just becomes more and more extreme.
Yeah, it's almost like crossing a line you can't come back from.
Yeah, and sadly for Gillis, this was just the beginning.
Right, and unfortunately, between 1994 and 2004, Gillis went on to murder a total of 8 women.
Right.
His methods varied, but they were all horrific: stabbing, strangulation, blunt force trauma. It's unsettling to think about how someone could inflict that kind of pain on another person.
It is, and he also sexually assaulted some of his victims
Mm-hmm.
and would often mutilate their bodies after death.
Right.
This was a pattern for him, and it even extended to him keeping trophies from his victims.
That's a truly disturbing detail.
It is in many serial killer cases we see this compulsion to keep trophies,
Yeah.
pieces of clothing, jewelry, or even body parts.
Oh, wow.
It's a way for them to exert control, to maintain a connection with their victims, and in some cases, to relive the power they felt during the murders.
So it's almost as if they're creating a twisted collection
Yeah,
to memorialize their crimes.
that's a good way to put it. And Gillis went even further by taking photographs of his victims, including the mutilated bodies of women like Donna Bennett Johnston.
It's hard to even fathom the kind of mindset that would lead someone to do something like that.
It certainly defies easy explanation, but the act of photographing the victims, especially after death, seems to suggest a desire to not only commit the crime, but to document and preserve it as well,
Right.
almost like creating a macabre gallery of his own making.
That's just bone-chilling.
Yeah.
Was this purely for his own gratification, or could there have been a deeper, more sinister motivation at play?
Well, that's a question psychologists and criminologists continue to debate.
Yeah.
Some believe that serial killers like Gillis are driven by a deep-seated need for power and control, that the act of killing and then meticulously documenting their crimes gives them a sense of mastery over life and death.
Mm-hmm.
Others argue that there's a profound disconnect from reality at play, a lack of empathy so profound that they simply can't process their victims as human beings.
So they become almost like objects in their minds.
Exactly.
Right.
And in Gillis's case, he even admitted that sometimes he didn't understand his own motivations for killing.
Oh, wow.
He would later say he just did it.
Which is a terrifying thought. The idea that someone could commit such horrific acts without any clear sense of purpose, without any real motive.
It does challenge our basic understanding of human behavior.
Yeah.
We like to believe that there's a logic behind every action, even in the most horrific crimes.
Right.
But cases like Gillis's remind us that sometimes the darkness inside a person can be too deep for us to ever fully grasp.
And speaking of context, it's important to remember that Gillis wasn't operating in a vacuum.
Right.
During this same period, there was another serial killer, Derek Todd Lee, who was also active in Baton Rouge.
Right.
Imagine the kind of fear and uncertainty that must have gripped the community,
Oh, yeah.
knowing that 2 serial killers were operating in their midst.
Absolutely. The presence of 2 active serial killers in the same area at the same time would create an unprecedented level of fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
It put enormous pressure on law enforcement to catch both perpetrators.
Yeah.
And for everyday citizens, particularly women, it would have instilled a constant anxiety and vulnerability.
Just the thought of not knowing who to trust, who to be afraid of,
Right.
it must have been utterly paralyzing.
It would have been incredibly difficult to feel safe knowing that danger could be lurking anywhere.
Right.
To add to the complexity, some of Gillis's murders were initially misattributed to Derek Todd Lee.
Wait, so they thought Lee was responsible for some of Gillis's crimes? How did that happen?
Well, in the early days of these investigations, DNA technology wasn't as advanced as it is today.
Right.
So investigators often had to rely on other forms of evidence, eyewitness accounts,
Right.
physical evidence found at the scene, things like that.
I see. So it was easier to make mistakes back then.
Exactly. And that's what makes accurate forensic investigations so crucial.
Right.
We've seen throughout history how cases can be misjudged, particularly in the early days of forensic science.
So this misattribution or murders just added to the confusion and terror in the community.
Absolutely.
It must have felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from.
It's hard to imagine the level of fear and frustration people must have felt, especially knowing that law enforcement was struggling to connect the dots.
And it also underscores the importance of those forensic advancements, not only to ensure that justice is served,
Right.
but also to give a sense of closure and peace to the victims' families.
It's a reminder that while we've made huge strides in forensic science, these cases are always incredibly complex.
Right.
And there are always human factors at play that can lead to errors.
Let's talk about Gillis's final victim, Donna Bennett Johnston.
Okay.
In February of 2004, he raped and strangled her, and the mutilation of her body was particularly extensive this time.
Right.
It's almost as if his violence was escalating with each victim.
You're right to notice that pattern.
Yeah.
Many serial killers escalate over time. Their crimes become more frequent and more violent.
And in Donna's case, he really went to extremes, slashing her breasts, cutting off a nipple, gouging out a tattoo, even severing her arm.
It's hard to even begin to understand the level of depravity involved in those actions.
Right.
Sadly, for many serial killers, it's this final act of violence, the one that pushes their rituals to the extreme, that leads to their capture.
Was that the case with Gillis? Did the brutality of this murder lead to his arrest?
Yes, it did. Tire tracks found near Donna's body led police straight to Gillis.
So it seems like his need to exert more and more control
Right.
ultimately led to his downfall.
Yes, that's often the case with serial killers. They become overconfident, their rituals become more elaborate and extreme, and that's when they tend to make mistakes. In Gillis's case, it was those tire tracks that finally exposed him.
What happened after he was arrested? Did he confess to the murders?
He did. Gillis was arrested in April 2004 and confessed to all 8 murders, providing specific details that matched the evidence. Ultimately, he was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Wow, so he basically admitted to everything.
Yes, he did, and that's where things take another interesting turn. After his arrest, he began exchanging letters with a woman named Tammy Purpura, who was a friend of Donna Bennett Johnston,
Right.
his final victim.
That's surprising.
Yeah,
What would compel him to reach out to a friend of one of his victims?
it's a complex question,
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But in these letters, Gillis expressed remorse for his crimes, particularly for the way he had mutilated Donna's body. He even went so far as to describe himself as pure evil.
That's a chillingly accurate self-assessment,
It is.
considering the horrific nature of his crimes.
But it also raises important questions about the nature of remorse and whether someone who has committed such atrocities can truly feel genuine regret.
Right. Can we ever really know what's going on inside the mind of someone like Gillis?
That's the difficulty with these cases.
Yeah.
We can analyze the facts, you can try to understand the psychology, but there's always an element of mystery, a darkness that we may never fully comprehend.
Yeah.
And to make things even more perplexing, Gillis also admitted in these letters that he sometimes didn't even understand his own motivations for killing. He just felt compelled to do it.
That lack of self-awareness just adds another layer to the puzzle, doesn't it?
It does. It makes it that much harder to create a clear profile, to identify those red flags that might help us prevent future tragedies.
It's a stark reminder that evil can lurk beneath the surface in ways we can't always predict or understand.
Right.
It's unsettling to think that someone could seem so ordinary and yet be capable of such darkness.
Exactly. And Gillis's case became a prime example of that unsettling reality. In fact, it garnered so much attention that it was featured in a whole slew of documentaries and true crime shows. The Devil You Know, Dead of Night, Born to Kill. The list goes on and on.
It seems like there's an endless fascination with true crime.
Right?
I know I'm guilty of getting hooked on those shows myself.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about these cases that captivates us so much?
Well, for one thing, they tap into our primal fears, our anxieties about the darkness that exists in the world, and the vulnerability we all feel in the face of it.
Yeah.
But I think it goes deeper than that.
Uh-huh.
These stories also offer a glimpse into the darkest corners of the human psyche, forcing us to confront the unsettling reality that evil can exist in the most unexpected places,
Right.
even within seemingly ordinary people.
And maybe there's a part of us that wants to understand how someone could become like that. Is it nature, nurture, or some combination of both?
Right.
Do you think these shows ever exploit these tragedies for the sake of entertainment?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
It's crucial to remember that behind every case file, every sensational headline, there are real victims, families who have suffered unimaginable loss.
Right.
Our interest in these cases should always be tempered with respect and sensitivity for the human cost of these crimes.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the psychological puzzle, the mystery of it all, and lose sight of the fact that these were real people whose lives were brutally cut short.
It's a delicate balance, and it's one that producers of true crime content need to be acutely aware of.
Yeah.
We need to strive to inform and educate without sensationalizing or exploiting the suffering of others.
So it's about finding that middle ground,
Yeah.
engaging our curiosity about the criminal mind, while also honoring the victims and acknowledging the impact these crimes have on their loved ones and the community as a whole.
Exactly. And I think it's also crucial to remember that these cases can provide valuable lessons about the importance of prevention and early intervention.
Yeah.
If we can learn to recognize the warning signs, if we can address the underlying societal issues that contribute to violence and criminality, then maybe we can prevent future tragedies from happening.
That's a good point. Now, going back to Gillis for a moment,
Okay.
you mentioned earlier that some of his crimes were initially misattributed to Derek Todd Lee,
Right.
who was operating in the same area at the same time.
Right.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that and how it impacted the investigation?
Of course. The presence of two active serial killers in Baton Rouge created an atmosphere of unprecedented fear and uncertainty.
Right.
It put immense pressure on law enforcement, and it also made it more difficult to connect the dots, to see the patterns that might link certain crimes to a particular perpetrator.
So it was almost like they were working against the clock, trying to track down two monsters at the same time.
It was a complex and challenging situation for everyone involved,
Yeah.
and the misattribution of some of Gillis's crimes to Lee only added to the confusion.
Right.
It created delays in the investigation and may have even allowed Gillis to continue his spree for longer than he might have otherwise.
And for the community, it must have felt like they were living in a real-life horror movie,
Yeah.
not knowing which shadow held the greater danger.
Absolutely. It's hard to overstate the psychological toll that kind of fear and uncertainty would have taken on the community. It would have created a sense of vulnerability and mistrust that would have been incredibly difficult to shake.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that the victims in these cases were often marginalized women,
Right.
which raises concerns about whether their disappearances or deaths were given the same level of attention and urgency as they might have been if the victims had been from a different demographic.
That's a crucial point, and it's a pattern we see in many serial killer cases throughout history.
Yeah.
Sadly, the victims who are most vulnerable, those who are already on the margins of society, are often the ones who are targeted, and their stories can sometimes be overlooked or dismissed.
It's a tragic injustice that we need to continue to fight against. Every victim deserves justice, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Absolutely. We need to ensure that law enforcement and the media treat every case with the same level of attention and dedication, regardless of the victim's social standing.
And it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant about protecting those who are most vulnerable in our society. Now let's delve a bit deeper into Gillis's psyche, into the darkness that drove him to commit these horrific acts. We've already touched on his own words, his admission of being pure evil, and his bewilderment at his own motivations. But what else can we glean from the sources about his psychological state?
Well, one thing that stands out is his compulsion to keep trophies and photographs of his victims,
Right.
which, as we discussed earlier, is a disturbingly frequent occurrence in serial killer cases.
And in Gillis's case, it seemed like the trophies were a way for him to maintain a connection to his victims, to relive the power and control he felt during the murders.
Yes, and the photographs add another layer of complexity.
Right.
Some experts believe that the act of photographing the victims, especially after death, suggests a desire to not only commit the crime, but also to document and preserve it,
Yeah.
almost like creating a macabre gallery of his own making.
That's a truly chilling thought.
It is.
It almost suggests a need to not only exert control over the victims, but also over the narrative, to shape how his crimes will be remembered.
That's a fascinating interpretation, and certainly possible that Gillis was driven by a need to create a lasting legacy, however twisted that might be.
It makes you wonder if part of him wanted to be caught, to have his work recognized and studied.
That's a question that has been debated in many serial killer cases.
Yeah.
Is there a subconscious desire for recognition, even notoriety, that drives their actions?
It's a disturbing thought, but it's hard to ignore that possibility.
It is, and I think it's a testament to the complexity of the human mind,
Yeah.
to the depths of darkness that can lurk within even the most seemingly ordinary individuals.
And ultimately, it's that complexity that makes cases like this so fascinating yet so terrifying.
Yeah.
We can analyze the facts, we can try to understand the psychology, but there's always a sense of mystery, a chilling reminder that we may never fully comprehend the depths of human depravity.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
There's a reason why we're so drawn to true crime. It forces us to confront the darkness that exists in the world, to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that monsters can walk among us,
Right.
hidden in plain sight.
And it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, to pay attention to those red flags,
Right.
to support initiatives that promote mental health awareness and early intervention programs.
Absolutely. These cases are a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with flashing lights and sirens.
Yeah.
They can be subtle, insidious, and often it hides behind a veneer of normalcy.
So we've explored the life and crimes of Sean Vincent Gillis, and frankly, it's been a pretty heavy journey.
Right.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to shift our focus from the darkness
Yeah.
to something a bit more, well, hopeful.
Yeah.
What can we as a society learn from cases like this?
That's a crucial question. And while there's no easy answer, no magic formula to prevent future tragedies,
Right.
I do believe there are some key takeaways.
Yeah, it feels like we've been wading through some pretty dark waters with this deep dive.
Yeah.
But as we wrap things up, I'm hoping we can shift gears a bit and talk about
Yeah.
what we can learn from Gillis's case.
Right.
Maybe even find some glimmers of hope or ways to prevent similar tragedies in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
You're right. It has been a heavy conversation. But I do think there are valuable lessons to be learned from cases like this. First and foremost, I think it's crucial to acknowledge that violence, especially against women, is often a symptom of deeper societal issues.
Right.
We're talking about things like misogyny, power imbalances, a lack of support for vulnerable populations.
Right.
Addressing these root causes is essential if we want to create a safer world for everyone.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about examining the conditions that allowed this kind of darkness to flourish in the first place.
Exactly. We need to shift our focus from reaction to prevention.
Right.
And that means having those uncomfortable conversations about the systemic factors that contribute to violence and inequality.
It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
Absolutely. Another key takeaway is the importance of improving our understanding of criminal behavior.
Yeah.
As we've seen with Gillis, the path to becoming a serial killer isn't always clear-cut. There's no single profile, no foolproof set of warning signs.
It's not like there's a checklist you can go through
Right.
to identify a potential serial killer.
Right. It's far more nuanced than that.
Right.
But by investing in research, mental health resources, and early intervention programs, we can hopefully start to identify potential risk factors
Yeah.
and intervene before it's too late.
You know, one thing that struck me as we were going through these sources was how Gillis's criminal record started with relatively minor offenses.
Yeah.
It was like a gradual escalation over time.
Right.
It makes you wonder if there were missed opportunities along the way, points where intervention might have been possible.
That's a really important point, and it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to criminal justice, one that focuses not just on punishment, but also on rehabilitation and reintegration. For some individuals, a criminal record can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to further isolation, despair, and ultimately more crime. We need to break that cycle by providing support, opportunities for personal growth and second chances.
So it's not just about locking people up.
Right.
It's about creating a society where they're less likely to end up behind bars in the first place.
Precisely. It's about addressing those underlying social and economic inequalities that can create a breeding ground for despair, anger, and violence. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to remember the victims.
Right. Their story should never be forgotten.
Absolutely. Their lives, their families, their communities, they were all irrevocably impacted by these horrific acts. By honoring their memories, by supporting their families, by advocating for policies that protect vulnerable populations, we can ensure that their suffering was not in vain.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that while we can't undo the past, we can learn from it and work towards a future where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
Exactly. We can choose to be a force for good in the world, to advocate for justice, to support those who are hurting, and to work towards creating a society where everyone feels safe and valued.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive,
Yes.
albeit a difficult one,
Yeah.
as we wrap things up.
Okay.
I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the why of Sean Vincent Gillis, what might have driven him to commit these horrific acts.
Right.
But what about the how? How do we as individuals and as a society create a world where these kinds of horrors are less frequent, less likely to happen? What role can each of us play in promoting empathy, understanding, and a genuine sense of community?
Those are powerful questions.
Yeah.
And they're ones that we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah.
It's through those difficult conversations, through our shared commitment to building a more just and compassionate world, that we can truly honor the memories of those lost and work towards preventing future tragedies.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.